You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today we discuss Dante and poetry. We want to join in celebrating the 700th anniversary of Dante's greatest work, the Divine Comedy. Our special guest is Daniel Fitzpatrick, the most recent translator of the Divine Comedy into English. Fitzpatrick grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and studied philosophy at the University of Dallas and Holy Apostles College and Seminary. He lives with his wife, Grace, and their 2 children in Hot Springs, Arkansas. We first begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, let's begin with your first real meeting with Dante. Danny, what was it? How did it happen? What was your response?
Sure. Yeah, thank you all so much for having me on the program today. As you mentioned, I studied at the University of Dallas, which is where I first encountered Dante. Of course, I had heard of him before, but it was there as part of their core curriculum. There's a sequence of literature courses that every student is required to take. So every student, basically in the second semester of freshman year, reads the Divine Comedy. So that was my first real encounter with Dante. It was an overwhelming experience in a lot of ways. Especially at that time, I was a very obsessive sort of reader. So I really had to stop basically after every line and flip back and read the notes, and then go back to the poem. So it was kind of a tough reading experience for me, in that I felt more like I was swallowing the whole classical tradition at a gulp, rather than just sort of actually experiencing poetry. It was very different from my first encounter with the Iliad, for instance. So when I read the Iliad, there weren't really any notes in the edition that I read. And so I remember just sort of reading over the opening 8 lines or so several times, and just embracing the poetry, and just taking my time to get to know Homer in that way. With Dante, it was very different. I found it much more academic. I found it much more dry in certain places. But then there were also these moments of just piercing spiritual beauty that I found in the poem that, of course, I hadn't found anywhere else before. So there's some descriptions in the poem of just the way that grace operates, really, and the way that the justice and the mercy that's perfectly combined in Christ's sacrifice on the cross that I had never heard expressed so well or so beautifully anywhere else.
Mario, you want to take us forward?
Well, my question is, what would you say to a young student today that he may or she may really get inspired or encounter the mystery of reality reading Dante, when there are too many people around who may say, well, it's a waste of time?
Sure. That's a great question. And I think the first thing I would say is just to spend time with the poem itself, to focus on the actual text, and to try to allow the text to breathe and to speak to the individual mind, and to try to experience Dante maybe in a collaborative setting. So something that really helps to sort of engender the love for Dante that I have now is I had some really great teachers, as well as some really great fellow students who were reading the poem with me. But in particular, my professor was Dr. Teresa Kenny at the University of Dallas. And she had been taught by Dr. Robert Hollander at Princeton, who of course has one of the great translations with his wife, Jean Hollander, of the poem, and is also he's just someone who has spent his life basically immersed in Dante. And I can't remember if it was every year or every other year, but Dr. Hollander would visit the University of Dallas in the springtime. And so I had that experience of not only having Dr. Kenny, who's an incredible Dante scholar, but also having Dr. Hollander come visit. He came and spent time in our class. He was extremely generous with his time, just in allowing students to come sit with him one-on-one, freshmen, undergraduates to come just pick his brain about Dante, giving lectures, of course, in the evenings, all these sorts of things. And so what really helped me to get into Dante was that experience of a communal effort to appreciate and celebrate the poem, and to see that there are people like Dr. Hollander who just spend decades on decades digging into the poem and finding in it not only boundless academic and scholastic riches, but also just endless spiritual insight and endless fodder for personal growth in holiness. So that's kind of what I would encourage, is just one, to read the poem in as relaxed a way as possible, without maybe trying to read every footnote and grasp every reference, but also trying to approach it in a spirit of community with other readers, and hopefully with teachers who can help to light the way.
Before moving, you said a word I think it caught my attention. You said something along the line that you can grow in holiness. But my question is, what about if you teach that of Dante or the Divine Comedy in a secular university? How then you go about approach so that people can be embrace that poem?
Oh my goodness. I'm glad that's not a present difficulty that I face, because I think that's a really great question, and I think a really profound difficulty that people must encounter in the university setting, because it's not. I don't think it's a poem where you can just sort of look at the classical elements of it and say, look at all the references to Virgil and Ovid and all these things. You can, but at every moment Dante is tying it in with faith. And I think, the easiest way to do it might be to try to kind of take an Aristotelian backdoor into mystic philosophy and theology. just because the structure of the poem is so fundamentally indebted to Aristotle's ethics, that I think that might be the easiest way in a secular setting to try to encounter all of the riches of the poem, because Aristotle, is as much as people try to, I think, put him aside today as no longer really relevant. I think just the power of his common sense philosophy is such that it can't be ignored. And the way that he's able to look at the human person in relation to nature, in the way that our faculties relate to the world around us, remains compelling today. So I think that might at least be a suggestion for a way to begin, is to try to take a common sense philosophy approach, as a means then to turn into the Thomistic philosophy, which I was reading an essay by Joseph Pieper, who mentioned that one of Thomas Aquinas's students was one of Dante's teachers. So I thought that was cool. I can't remember the name of that student and teacher there, but I thought that was really exciting.
And Christopher.
Yeah, I was talking about relating Dante to modern readers. I think one of the things which is striking about the poem, and I've read it several times, unfortunately not in Italian, but what is striking about the poem is how it presents religion. And I think it presents religion in a way which is foreign to how people nowadays often think about religion. We tend in our time to think about religion as something, a personal thing. It's a movement of our passions or emotions. But Dante, see if you think this is correct, he presents religion as something very objective and actually as an object of what he would call science, right? Scientia, or St. Thomas would call science. And so do you think do you ever find that with students, that's something which is something they have to overcome, or something which is a revelation to them, that religion, for Dante and deep in the Middle Ages, religion is something about the objective world. It's not primarily about my heart. It's about the world in which I live.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at the poem, because that's really again kind of looking at that Aristotelian structure of the poem. That's kind of the way that Dante lays the whole thing out. Is look, of course the heart is moved by different things. Our passions move us. All of this, but that has very real consequences as far as the actual structure of the universe. And my ultimate place within that structure is dependent on my relation to it. And so I think, yeah, that's one of the things that can be off-putting about Dante for people today, of course, is that for all of Dante's emotion, and I think he is very emotional throughout the poem, that emotion is kind of laid over this very strict structure that's organized not by my own sort of attempts to fashion myself, to forge some kind of relationship between myself and some divinity that's out there, but by a structure that's organized basically by everything being in a generic relationship to the three in one, to everything that's organized according to relationship to the Trinity. And so there is something that's very, very strict and very fixed about that view of the universe that people can find off-putting, but there's something that's enormously comforting in it as well. There's a way I'm able to relax in the structure that God has provided for me, rather than trying to strike out on my own in this sort of chaotic soup of being that I think Dante presents to us as, look, there is a way to go. There is a proper way to go about things. And so much of the anguish of the opening of the poem is because he's lost the way, right? He finds himself in the woods where he's lost the way. But we can only lose a way if there is a way to begin with. And I think that is so much of the comfort that the poem provides, is that there is a way for us to go that results in our happiness and fulfillment as beings.
Yeah, and two, I mean, what's interesting, it's not just a way which is revealed, right? It's a way which reason can see it, because it's Virgil who leads him most of the way up to purgatory, and Virgil is not divine revelation, right? I think that's yes, it's very significant in the poem.
How Danny, did you come to translate the work?
Yes, so I started it because I read an essay by Ezra Pound, who recommends, among other things, if you want to be a good poet, that you should at some point translate the works of a great poet. And basically his reasoning is that in painting, I guess in sculpture, one of the ways, of course, that you become a master is by copying the masters. And of course, there's value in, copying out a Shakespearean sonnet or something like that, and just writing it down. I think it was Hunter S. Thompson, maybe, who just wrote out The Great Gatsby, just to feel what it felt like physically to write a great book. But there's something, it takes it to a different level to translate a master from his tongue into your own. So that's why I started it, was just to try to get better as a poet. So that was back in 2017. And it kind of coincided with when I started my graduate work at Holy Apostles. I took a course with Dr. Michela Ferri on Dante. So kind of in the context of that course, I came back to the poem and decided, well, let me try translating a little bit. So it went very, very slowly at first, and of course I never had any intention of having it published or even trying to have it published. But then things just kind of worked along providentially, which is the only reason that I have any kind of confidence in the project at all, is that it surely would not have happened without the agency of Providence.
Yeah, and then how did this guy named Sebastian Mahfoud get involved with it? I mean, we had run-ins with him on this program.
Yeah, he is everywhere. Dr. Mahfoud.
Is it true that he only sleeps 4 hours a day?
Ubiquitous.
Yeah. That's what I've heard.
Oh.
Yeah, so he of course has runs En route Books and Media, which I found out about just from Holy Apostles. So around that time, 2017 as well, I had written a novel, Only the Lover Sings, which is a fictionalized version of my family's experience after Hurricane Katrina. When our house flooded, we had to leave, and it kind of takes that outward external tragedy, and against that backdrop looks at the relationship of two friends who, as a result of the tragedy, are moved toward and away from faith. So one of them embraces his faith, the other turns to atheism, and so it kind of explores their relationship, and just kind of the way that people respond to tragedy. At any rate, I had this novel. I knew that Dr. Mahfoud had this publishing house, so I sent over the novel to him, and I was very blessed to have it ultimately published by En route. And then shortly thereafter, I sent Dr. Mahfoud just the first few Kanti of the translation, just because obviously he's done quite a lot of work on Dante. So I figured I'd just share it with him, just see what he thought. And so around that time, he got in touch with Tim Schmalz, who talked about his own Dante project. And that is kind of when everything came together as far as trying to actually put a new translation out there with Tim's illustrations. So it's been a very humbling and very providential experience.
Now, you mentioned Professor Hollander, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Was his translation your favorite one going into your own project?
Yeah, I like his quite a lot. And I think something that's so good about his translation is that it combines his, of course, very, very extensive Dante scholarship with his wife's poetic talent. And so that's what really draws me to their translation, is that it has a very nice poetic touch to it. It doesn't feel sort of plodding to me, like some other translations do at times. I think it's just done with a very gentle touch that's informed, obviously, by maybe the greatest Dante scholarship that we have right now.
Christopher, don't you have a different favorite translator? You're muted. Unmute.
Okay, there we go.
All right.
Yeah, actually, the first translation I ever read was in college, was Sinclair's prose translation with the Italian on the other side. Even though I don't know Italian, I could sort of figure it out because I knew enough Latin. But over the years, my favorite has become Longfellow's translation. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's an old translation. For many years, it was very hard to find, but now it's been reprinted. And I find, and there's an example, I think, of a poet who I really didn't generally like before, and whose earlier works I really still don't like, but whose later works I think benefited from translating Dante, particularly his sonnets on the Divine Comedy. So that was my favorite. I don't know if you're familiar with the Longfellow translation.
Yeah, I've not read it at length, but I've read passages, and I would agree with you that there are some of his later poems which are some of my favorites. Definitely seem to show Dante's influence. Seems that process of translating bore a lot of fruit.
Mario, thoughts at this point?
So if I'm not mistaken, a translator is also an interpreter. And the best way to interpret something is going to the world of the one that you want to interpret. So his horizon will be your horizon. So generally, I heard that you need to go to the world where that word was written. Since we cannot do that because we cannot go back to the Middle Ages. Have you spent time in Florence to grasp the environment, the culture where Dante grew up?
Yeah, so it's been quite a while, but when I was a student at the University of Dallas, they have a campus just outside of Rome. So I spent the spring semester of 2011 living there. And as part of the program, we took a trip to Florence. So I've had the blessing to spend only a few days there, and of course it's been 10 years now. But yeah, that was, of course, constantly sort of in my mind, going through the translation, just kind of thinking back to that experience of Italy. And of course, I think Italy as a whole is constantly running through the poem. And part of what makes it so glorious is that Dante just sort of revels in all of these descriptions of nature. Like all these similes about bees and ants and wildfires and rivers. And it's just, we're constantly immersed in the Italian landscape in the poem. So that was always on my mind. I think too that it helped a lot just to spend time with Aristotle and St. Thomas. And also, as a high school student, I read quite a bit of the Aeneid in my Latin classes. So I think just having those kind of looking at his philosophical and poetic influences is at least one of the ways that for me has been most fruitful in terms of trying to get into his mind as much as I can.
Do you think that we in the 21st century, this postmodern or late modern world, have lost a lot from the world of Dante?
I think we have. And I think what has occurred to me over the course of the translation process, what seems to me that we've lost the most is a view of nature as something that really has a kind of binding effect on the way that beings interact in the world. So in 1946, Sartre had a lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, wherein he made the claim that there is no human nature because there's no God to create it, which seems to me exactly, just to sum up everything that is counter to Dante, because everything in Dante is about the idea that things, including humans, have natures, and that those natures direct them to particular ends. And it's that by living out of that nature that we come to be what we're meant to be. And so I think, to me, that has just kind of resonated again and again as what we've lost most. Is that today we have very little sense that, really that anything has a nature, but especially it's really hammered into us. And I think we can see it in, very clearly in the politics of today, that there is no nature anymore. And your nature is up to you to determine completely. And Dante, of course, is, completely counter to that. Of course we have free will. We make choices, but ultimately those choices, if they're to bring us happiness, have to come out of our nature, which is directed to the supreme happiness in the beatific vision.
Christopher.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question about translating itself. It's often said you can't really translate a poem, and to some degree I can see that. Not this was a poem, but I remember when I was reading St. Augustine many, many years ago in English, and then I got to read the same thing he wrote in Latin. It's a whole new world, right? St. Augustine has internal rhyme. There's just a certain rhythm to his language, which can never be translated to English. To what degree is your poem Dante, and what degree is it your own work?
Yeah, so I've tried to keep myself out of it as much as possible. And part of that comes from my own experience just as a high school student reading Virgil. So I first read the Aeneid in Latin, and then in college I read it again in English in the Fitzgerald translation. I remember just being so frustrated when I would get to certain passages, and I'd be all excited, anticipating a certain phrase, a certain word that's going to come up, and then Fitzgerald doesn't have it in there. And so I remember talking to a really great friend of mine who's since passed, Father Raymond Fitzgerald, and he made the comment, the Fitzgerald translation is great, but at the end of the day, it's more Fitzgerald's poem than Virgil's. So that has really, I've kind of had that judgment in my mind throughout the whole translation process. And so my attempt is always to remain as close to the original as possible. I think fortunately, Italian, or Dante's Italian, is a little bit easier to sort of manage than like Virgilian, or especially like Augustinian Latin. And I think it also helps that, there are so many translations of Dante available that to try to kind of zero in on what Dante himself is going for. Fortunately, we have all these other kind of touch points that we can look at and kind of triangulate the translation based on the original, and then looking at 3 or 4 other translations to try to be as faithful as possible. Of course, translation is composed of choices, and my choices are going to be different from other people's. They're going to be informed by my own poetic preferences and things like that. But I've tried to stay as close to Dante as I can.
How true do you think the statement is that you cannot translate poetry?
So I think it's. I have very I have very mixed sort of gut reactions to that, because on the one hand, I would say I think it's fair to say with Robert Frost that what is lost in that poetry is what is lost in translation, right? Because a poem is what it is in virtue of being arranged in a specific way in a specific language, in occupying a certain amount of space on a page, and in having all of the formal characteristics that the poet put into it. And of course, those are always going to be lost to some degree in translation. I mean, they must. Everything in a sense is lost because we're no longer in the same tongue. At the same time, I think just experientially, I would say that some of the most important development in poetry come from the act of translation. So like there's been a lot of influence in American poetry in the last 50 years or so from translation of Eastern European poets. And so I think it's, you don't get, of course, the poem when you engage in translation. But I think poetry still comes across. And I think poetry, when it's well expressed in any language, if it's brought over into another language with any sort of skillful hand, will retain a lot of its vitality.
Do you have a sense, Danny, of how far Dante's Italian is from contemporary Italian?
So I have a sense of it. I don't know that my sense corresponds to anything that real scholars could say on the matter. But just from having studied Latin and modern Italian, reading Dante feels to me much more like reading modern Italian than reading Latin, for instance. So I think for the most part, it's not too terribly far from what we have today in Italian. Of course, you come across words that, if you look in a modern Italian dictionary, will not be there. But it's much closer, I think at least, than say, even Middle English to modern English.
Interesting. Now, what I want to ask next is related to what we've just been speaking of, but it goes out. When Dante wrote, as I understand it, he wrote for a broad, popular audience. Given that, probably a great percentage of the people were not literate. Nonetheless, he did write for a broad, popular audience. And certainly when we read about Shakespeare's plays, they were written for people who were in the peanut gallery, so to speak. But now it's just so hard for most of us to read Dante and to read Shakespeare, even in the best translations. And what's happened? In 50 words or less. Oh, no.
Oh, goodness.
What has happened and what is happening? Because it's all the time, I think, getting worse. A statistic that I've used lately is that of all undergraduates enrolled today in the United States, only 7% are in the humanities.
Yeah, it's amazing just reading little snippets about the popular influence of Dante in Italy. I was reading an article just the other day about this fellow, I think his name is Dario Cecchini, who lives in Florence, and he's a butcher, I think, but he, I guess, knows pretty much all of the Divine Comedy by heart, and so his life is just composed of like references to Dante, which I think is amazing, and just, you know, and he talks about how there's been that the whole time, how there would be, you know, a lot of illiterate people who nonetheless had most, if not all, of the comedy committed to heart. And then, of course, you know, you mentioned Shakespeare and the fact that, you know, these plays were performed for all sorts of people. And I have wondered to some degree about just the nature of a play in its relation to an audience, as opposed to the play as a document on the page. I'd be really curious just to know, like, if the folks in the peanut gallery in Shakespeare's day had the text before them, assuming they could read, how they would have reacted to it. But I do think that overall, just one of the difficulties we face across all facets of experience today is that we have very little symbolic imagination anymore. I think it's one of the biggest problems that we see just in things like mass attendance. One of the things that's so hard for people to get excited about with the mass is that we no longer see symbols very much when they're presented to us. We no longer have much grasp for what's figurative, for what can transport us beyond just the physical experience that unfolds around me. And even that is very often missed, I think, just because we have, I think largely due to technology today, you know, it's harder to pay attention to anything around me when I've got the whole world in my pocket. And so I think there's that element to it. I think that is a big, I think that's kind of at the heart of it, right? Is that something that makes Dante and Shakespeare so relatable, is that they talk about real things. You know, Dante, of course, has so much philosophy in there, but he gets to the philosophy by looking a lot of times at ants or bumblebees or fires or trees, things that we tend to not really look at anymore. And so it's harder for those sorts of elements of poetry, I think, to take root in the imagination in the way that they historically would have for people who were used to looking at the things that Dante was looking at, the things that Shakespeare was looking at, that I think we as a society tend not to really look at anymore, whether from lack of opportunity or lack of attention.
Sad stuff. Mario.
What you are referring remind me of a very good theologian in Latin America who at one point was, I think, the teacher of Pope Bergoglio, Lucio Gera. He had an interpretation of the history, Latin America and Europe, as two trends, one coming from the south, he said, which includes Spain, Italy, and Latin America in general, Hispanic America in general, which was he called the Baroque culture, which is fundamentally made of silence, nature, contemplation, where life is lower than the north, and people are more inclined to reflection rather than create manufactures and industries. According to him, the prejudice has been that culture was backward compared to the other, which was more linear, geometrical, inclined to hard sciences, industrialization, and etc. And so he said, well, that is what is happening. He pointed out precisely the figure of not only Dante in his example was Cervantes, who also in the Quixote was pretty much close to Shakespeare in the classics. And these two cultures, he said, we sometimes in the 20th century, he died a few years back, need to be reconciled. And that reconciliation was very hard. And that is the crisis that we are facing, he said. I'm talking about the 1980s, the 1980s. And when you're talking about this, it reminds me that this is just, when I feel a sense of nostalgia. It's a world which was lost. Today, that world is completely has disappeared, even in Latin America, because today the young fellow from any Latin American country behave as any American today because the globalization have given them only the measure of hard sciences, STEM, science, technology, and engineering, and the like. And that is right now, I think, is taking a toll in how people build their own democracy because they don't know where the values come from. And the crisis is profound. And I think the crisis is the crisis of classicism, of the classics. People don't know what human beings are anymore. Is that just my rant for today?
Good rant. And I bet you're going to tell me that Don Quixote really isn't that long a book.
No, one of the greatest, yes. Reading El Quixote is just an extraordinary transformation for anyone.
Take a year. It would take a year, right?
Yes. I mean, if you want to know about precisely this world, which is some people say is lost. I don't think it's lost for some, but Ortega y Gasset, the greatest Spanish philosopher, her first book was precisely Meditation on the Quixote, because that is what we need to, I don't want to use the word restore, but in somehow keep alive the sense of what is human.
Danny, you're the guest. What do you say about what Mario has just said?
I agree. There's nothing I could add.
What?
No, I think that's just it. I think there's this, again, just in the way that we talk about nature, we've lost so much. And there's this sense that, nature is that stuff out there, and I exist as something over against nature. And I'm over here in kind of the technological realm where I manufacture my own being. I chart the course of my own existence, and that over there is nice, and it makes a good background for my Zoom meetings. But other than that, it's not really that important. Whereas Dante presents us this vision of all of this, being ordered in relationship to God, and taking its order from that generic relationship, as someone like Dr. Peter Redpath might say, to the fundamental unity that exists in God. And I think that's there's just no sense anymore of the thought that we are meant for something in particular, and that we can better engage that nature by looking back, by reading Dante, by reading Shakespeare, by looking into Virgil and Homer, and all these people who have had this sense of what it is that makes us human.
Christopher Zehnder has been trying to get me to read Wendell Berry's Manifesto of a Mad Farmer.
I have.
Now, when Christopher first started trying to get me to read the Manifesto of a Mad Farmer, I said, why do I need to read that? I know you, Christopher. I know you. And he said, but Barry puts it more eloquently. Danny, have you ever read the Manifesto of a Mad Farmer?
I have not read that one, to my great shame. I've come across Barry in snippets. I need to dive into him.
Well, Christopher will have something to say about that and other more sensible things as well. You're on, Christopher.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Wendell Berry, because Wendell Berry has an insight, which I think my philosophical grandfather, Charles de Koninck, had as well. I thought I'd bring him. And that insight is that as human beings, we're parts of a greater whole, part of a structure. We don't, in the modern world, we don't see ourselves as part of the world in which we live. And I'm one of the reasons of environmental degradation is this. We don't see ourselves connected. We see ourselves, and it's really kind of, I think, a Manichaean dualistic mindset where we see ourselves as somehow abstracted from the world of flesh. We live in the flesh. We care about our bodies, right? People exercise. They care about their health, but we only look at them as just instruments of pleasure. But to really see ourselves as part and parcel of this whole thing is, I think, it probably rooted in part in bad, obviously rooted in bad philosophy, but it's also rooted in how we make our livings. We're not farmers anymore, for instance. We don't actually work with the soil. When I've had a lot of gardens, I've raised animals and things. So that's what you see that you are utterly dependent upon forces outside yourself, and that you're actually connected to those things. So unless we actually get back that insight that we are part of the universe, the preeminent parts of the universe, the parts for which the universe exists, but nevertheless are not disconnected. As we resist this Manichaean tendency, which was a tendency, as you know, in the Middle Ages. It was something that was one of the chief heresies that the Middle Ages had to fight with the Albigensians and the like. If we don't get to back to that sense, there really can be no poetry, I think.
Are there contemporary poets who are inspired by their Jewish faith or their Christian faith?
I'm sure there are. I don't know. I was trying to think of some names earlier. I'm not really sure. I know that there are a lot of poets who are engaging with the tradition in very interesting, I think very, very well informed ways. There's a poet, Gregory Pardlow, for instance, whose book Digest won the Pulitzer Prize, I think in 2016. But that book is basically, in a lot of ways, it's many things. But part of what makes it a very good book is that it's a series of reflections on the history of poetry and philosophy. So in the book, he's engaging with St. Thomas, St. Augustine, Kierkegaard, Epictetus. All these, he really addresses a very, very broad range of the tradition. So there's a lot of very excellent poetry that's being written, and that's engaging with the tradition. There's also a lot of poetry, of course, that's not at all concerned with the tradition, which I think presents a host of issues. I don't know, though, who the poets are. I mean, I know some personally, but I don't know who the major players would be today, as far as poets whose poetry really comes out of Christian or Jewish faith.
One example that comes to my mind, although she has now been dead for some years, is Denise Levertoff, who has a fusion of Judaism and Christianity, and thereby can't escape the deepest traditions that we know of, and yet was strongly engaged with social questions at the same time. I think she'd be worth looking at.
Yeah, and there are quite a few poets from the last 100 years that I think have been very much engaged. Robert Lowe, for instance, it was actually, I think, it eventually converted to Catholicism.
Yes.
His poetry was very much influenced by his faith. Richard Wilbur is a great poet who died just a couple of years ago, and was not, I think his poetry for the most part was not explicitly religious, but it had tremendous religious sensibility to it, and a kind of fundamental optimism, which is, kind of in the spirit of Dante.
Mario, comments?
Well, what you are saying precisely about the sensibility of what may be called the religious sense of reality, that we are here and that reality was given to us. I still have the very vivid memory of Dr. Quinn at the University of Kansas. And this very well known, I think, for some people, what is really the question, the essay by John Senior. The question is not precisely being taught in a clerical or Catholic environment, rather than to provoke the wonderment of reality. That's what is lost. And so at the end, you may have some vocation, but that's just pure grace. But ultimately, what attract people is the beauty. And you can do that in a very secular environment. If that poetry, I remember Dr. Quinn say, what I see in the poetry is not if that is Catholic or Christian. I'm looking at if it is really beautiful. And I think it's key. Some people maybe not be good poet. That is why it's not attractive. But I think that's what my assumption, my view is we need to bring it back, the attraction of beauty.
One name that just came to mind, and I can't believe I didn't think of him before, but Dana Joyah is a tremendous poet writing today whose work is very much informed by his faith.
And writing for a broad audience.
Yeah.
And getting into a certain amount of trouble because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Blaming some of poetry's demise on the poets. Christopher, one last question?
Well, what do we ask? What's your next project after Dante?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm working on several things right now. So I have a draft of another novel that I'm editing and trying to get prepared for eventual hopeful publication. And then I've started drafting another novel. And then I'm trying to assemble a collection of lyric poems, which will, hopefully find a publisher at some point. But that's, those are the main sort of projects. I do have, I'm trying to put together a nonfiction book, kind of a work of, I guess, light philosophy, something that's philosophical, but could appeal to a broad audience. Basically about the question of the Sabbath. And so I want to explore why it is that the Sabbath has been so universally lost today as part of our culture. And to see in that kind of the maybe fundamental sin that we have as a society. And I'm kind of taking my cue from the Catholic novelist Evelyn Waugh, who said that sloth is the besetting sin of the modern age. And so looking into that, I found that St. Thomas says that sloth is a sin opposed to the Sabbath. And so it occurred to me that there's probably you could probably write a book about the way that the two notions of our communal sort of acedia and the sort of complete dereliction of the Sabbath are connected, and how those things are really just reinforcing a lot of the problems that we have as a society today.
We're recording on Wednesday of Holy Week, and so we have the Sabbath of all Sabbaths to look forward to coming so very soon. And we always end with the gospel for the day. And I'm going to read from Matthew. One of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that time on, he looked for an opportunity to hand him over. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples approached Jesus and said, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, 'My appointed time draws near. In your house I shall celebrate the Passover with my disciples.'" The disciples then did as Jesus had ordered and prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he reclined at table with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Amen, I say to you, one of you will betray me." Deeply distressed at this, they began to say to him one after another, "Surely it is not I, Lord." He said in reply, "He who has dipped his hand into the dish with me is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man indeed goes, as it is written of him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had never been born." Then Judas, his betrayer, said in reply, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." He answered, "You have said so." Come, Lord Jesus, come. Danny, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.